in order to derive conclusions about what ought to be true or what should be true or what is morally right. It's totally possible to be a moral realist and a moral objectivist and still admit that you can't derive aught from is.
Well, it's possible, but not justifiable, right? You're not going to get there in any coherent way unless you just, okay, well, let's just be arbitrary. Okay, and if we can just be arbitrary, then then there's no such thing as debate. So once arbitrariness is allowed, then there's no such thing as debate, because I can be just as arbitrary as you see.
Yeah, so I've always viewed that little bit of Hume, and again, it is kind of an aside. It's not something he argues for at length, and yet people have made much of it in philosophy and in science.
You notice him downplaying that because it's a huge problem for his position. So he's like, well, Hume didn't spend a lot of time on that argument, and people have made a big deal about it. Well, so, I mean, if it's a simple argument, do I need to spend a lot of time making, 500-page books about it? Or can I just make the argument, and then that has nothing to do with this devastation? But, of course, the master of deflection here comes in to downplay this central problem for his position.
I viewed it as a kind of semantic trick which need not confine our thinking about these things. It's a little bit like...
Again, so it should be obvious right away. So how does he begin to try to deal with this? To deflect it into semantics. Hume's objection, which is a epistemic/logical objection. Okay, nothing to do with the definitions of words, although I'm sure he's going to tell us how it is about the definitions of words. You're not going to redefine words to get around objections. A lot of atheists do this. I think they think it's like a clever way to talk around a problem when they're pinned down or when their position is shown to be foolish. How many times have you heard an atheist say, "You're playing word games. You're just playing word games. Ha ha. Ha ha. You're playing word games. I gotcha." When, in fact, you made a very clear, very concise, pinpoint accuracy argument with a scalpel, right? You cut out their tumorous argument with a scalpel, and how do they respond? "Oh, you're playing a word game." And when obviously you're not. Come on, it's not a word game. And that's the direction that Sam's doing here.
Zeno's paradox. Zeno says, in order for an arrow to hit its target, it must move halfway to the target and then halfway again and halfway again. And they're...
Now this is odd because he's likening the objection to his position, which is a clear refutation, to something totally different, which is a paradox. Okay, a paradox is not a contradiction. And deflecting this over into something like that, again, is a deflection. So I have them turned all the way up. I don't know what else to tell you. There's just no way to make this work perfectly. I think I could turn them up a little bit more. Maybe I need to scale it back a little bit. I don't know why, but a lot of these YouTube videos, when you play them in this format, they just play really low, even though I've got it cranked all the way up.
Ergo, it never arrives. But of course, arrows don't have to fly that way. Arrows can just fly all the way to the target. And if you want to add, if you need mathematics where you sum the infinite series, or you do find some way of nullifying that argument, fine. But it's set up as and it took hundreds of years for people to figure out why it's wrong. But it is just, it's an unnatural constraint imposed by, in that case, just the geometry of the situation. In Hume's case, it's just the meaning we're giving words like.
Yeah, so just give words new meanings, and then it's not a problem. Now, remember that for most atheists, actually, you could probably argue 99.9% of them, unless they have some weird kind of fringe view, they will say that our conceptual schemes, the things that are the systems, the concepts, the words, the meanings that we have for understanding the external world are human created constructs. Now, if all of our systems, logic, math, words, sentences, grammar, if that's all purely a human creation, there's no extra mental thing in which our principles, logic, abstractions are grounded, i.e. the divine mind, then it seems to follow, as 99.9% of the atheists would agree, that the conceptual schema is a complete human construct. Now, that's not what Harris was intentionally saying, but that's probably what his position would affirm or lead to. Because unless he wants to affirm the real existence of abstract entities or objects or universals, which 99.9% of atheists don't, they don't want to go in that direction, then he's going to default to, well, yeah, we just make up these systems. They're just human schemas. Numbers are just, right, just made up by men. But at the same time as the internal mental system is a human construct, the principles of the external world that are supposed to match up to those concepts are supposed to be totally one-to-one, totally objective, totally rational, totally consistent with one another, connected to one another, and regular, you see. Do you see what I'm getting at? If I believe that my conceptual framework, my mental schema for how I understand the world is a human construct, I can't then turn around and say and act as if the words and the schema and all of that also literally matches up to things in the external world, because I can't make that move. It's not I don't have the right to make that move, you see. It's just a huge assumption. And when I start to act as if that is the case, now I'm starting to point out that, well, then it can't just be a human construct, right? Truth value, etc., meaning, these things can't be purely human constructs, because where are they grounded? How are they grounded? How do we know that they match up to objects in the external world? Now, if you've read the Mannion paper, you know that at a certain point he brings this up. He says that, you know, for foundationalists and the kind of classic foundationalist position, it hadn't really occurred to those people yet that, well, wait a minute. Is our conceptual scheme found in sense data? If our conceptual scheme is not found in sense data, then now we've got illicit moves that we're making, you see. Because what's the basis for the conceptual scheme by which we are understanding the principles of the world, right? Predicating about objects, etc. So I'm just pointing out that if you understand that objection, then not only can Harris not get off the ground, like, he's not even going to be able to make sentences. Do you see how devastating this critique is?
Ought and should versus is. Now, I think, so the other way to come at it from my point of view is you can give up all notion of ought and should. Let's say we're in the universe and there is no ought or should, or let's discover the oughts and shoulds. I mean, one question I have, which doesn't originate with me, I think many people have posed it this way, but if all the facts, if all the is claims in the universe aren't enough to give you some guidance as to how you ought to live, just what could give you that guidance, right? I mean, we're talking.
So Sam Harris doesn't understand the issue of justification, right? So, as often happens in this type of a discussion, people don't know what is expected or what kind of thing would count as a justification. And we see this all the time. And really, Harris here is just reflecting probably what most atheists will say in response to the is-ought question, right? And he's saying something like, well, you know, if you really want to make this a problem, then why don't we just say that this is the best we can do, right? If you want to flourish and do well, then you got to have moral values that help you flourish and do well. That's essentially where he'll go in this. And he's just going to say, you know, it's just the best we've got, so why do you keep bringing up this point? That's not a justification, right? This is a really simple point, philosophically speaking, right? I mean, if you have a certain position and you're going to enforce that kind of a justification on everyone else, then you're going to have to do the same thing. And these kinds of people do that all the time, right? It's like, Where's your justification for your miracle claims? Where's your justification for faith in that book? Where's your justification for belief in the existence of Jesus, a man 2,000 years ago, right? You got to do all this work. You got to justify every little nook and cranny of any claim you make. And then when it comes to like the big glaring elephant in the room assumptions and presuppositions that they have, well, come on. Oh, why you harassing me? Why you giving me a hard time on this? Why you give me a hard time on it? Why you busting your balls? Why you busting my balls on this? Right? Suddenly they go Tony Soprano. Why you busting my balls on this? Hey. Right? Because it's obvious that they don't have a justification. But as to whether Sam Harris himself actually grasps the notion of what justification is, that I'm not sure about. All right. I mean, we've seen him kind of have huge gaps in his philosophical understanding. He seems at times then to surprise us with actually knowing what the issue is. And so you think, oh, does he actually understand the issue? And then when asked for justification, it's like he doesn't even know what justification is, right? But then again, how many times have we seen people, public academics, supposedly, with no concept or idea what justification is? Or even anything close to it. On my life, T. It was the worst justification I ever heard. Now, again, so why do we want to stress that? Because most of the time, atheists will think, or the materialists will say, they'll give you a story. They'll report a story. Well, we evolved to do this, and then we evolved to do this, and that's it. Oh, whoa. Telling me a story, an account of events, is not a justification. I didn't ask you for a series of causal chains that led to why this is happening. I asked you for the justification for deriving oughts from is. It's a very simple question. It might sound a little obtuse. It's not. Basically, we're just saying, why should I make the move from the fact that something is the case to that it ought or ought not be this or that way? Do you see the difference? And so Sam Harris wants me to believe that you can, as a naturalist, atheist, materialist, make the move to moral realism. By the way, let's not even bring up the fact that he is a determinist. How are you going to have moral realism and oughts with determinism, which is a whole other level of stupidity and impossibility on top of this? But we're just going to move. We're going to stay on this question of the is and the ought, and let's listen to him get eviscerated.
That's in my book.
Yes. So I think Dan Dennett has made this point, and others have. So that's worth wondering, right? It's like what extra piece would you be hoping for? But let's say that
what we're hoping for is a logical justification. It's not an extra piece. It's not some outlandish, crazy thing that's being requested. It's the very same justification that you request of every theist. The very same principles justification that you're required to give for your principles and your beliefs is the same justification that we're asking of the theist. Remember in the Matt Dillahunty debate, how many times did I hammer this point home? Matt, you said no one should believe in anything unless they have empirical sense data to prove it. You just told me in the midst of this debate, Matt, that transcendental categories are not physical empirical things, but they must be the case. What is the justification for believing that, given what you just said? I'm not asking you if you believe it. I'm not asking you if you like it. I'm not asking you for a causal chain story of history of why people evolved to do this. I'm asking for a justification. It's a very simple point that you would learn in one epistemology class, had you had one. Trent Horn, hello. T-Dump, had you had one?